David Richardson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Tribeca penthouse, watching the city smear into streaks of silver rain. Behind him, Sophie sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, building towers with blocks in perfect silence. No giggles, no crashes, no words. 6 years old, and Sophie hadn't spoken since the night Marcus died. 2 years ago, David had been half of a power couple. Marcus had been the heart while David built the empire. Richardson Digital Solutions was worth $2.8 billion. But David would trade every penny to hear his daughter say just one word. It was cruel irony. He had revolutionized voice recognition software, created systems that understood thousands of languages. Yet he couldn't reach the child sleeping down the hall. Doctors said Sophie wasn't deaf, wasn't mute. Specialists from Manhattan, Boston, even Zurich all reached the same maddening conclusion: she could speak, she just wouldn't. David had missed 12 calls today while sitting on her bedroom floor, reading stories to a child who never responded. The apartment felt hollow. Marcus had filled it with laughter, terrible cooking, and off-key singing in the shower. Now silence pressed against David's chest like a weight he couldn't lift. Sophie's blocks toppled. The sound cracked the room like a gunshot. David turned, hoping for a sigh, maybe a tear. Nothing. Sophie simply reached for more blocks, her small face unreadable. The girl who had once called Marcus Papa and wrapped her arms around David's neck now lived in a world he couldn't enter. Through the glass, the city roared horns, shouting, life in thousands of voices David would never take for granted again. But here, only silence reigned. Marcus used to say the most important conversations happened without words. David was learning how terrifying that could be. Sophie was saying something profound through her silence, but David was too broken to understand. Outside, a sanitation truck rumbled past. David barely noticed. He had no idea salvation was about to arrive wearing an orange vest. Sometimes children grieve not by crying louder, but by falling completely quiet, waiting for someone patient enough to listen without demanding sound. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of November chill that made even luxury feel cold. David was buried in a conference call about quarterly projections when something inside the apartment shifted. It took him several minutes to realize what was missing. The soft, steady sound of Sophie's breathing from the living room was gone. Panic burned through him. He dropped the phone mid-sentence and tore through the penthouse, shouting her name into rooms that swallowed his voice. The elevator, the stairwell. Empty. The doorman hadn't seen her. Security footage showed a tiny figure slipping out during a shift change. David's hands shook as he yanked on his coat and bolted into the street. A billionaire who would have given everything just to find one missing child. He found her 3 blocks away, standing perfectly still on the sidewalk. But Sophie wasn't lost. She was watching. Miguel Santos moved with quiet rhythm along a sanitation route, separating recyclables from trash with methodical care. His orange vest was speckled with rain, his work boots worn but solid. He was the kind of person David's world rarely noticed: quiet infrastructure that kept everything else functioning. Sophie stood transfixed, her small fingers curled around the chain-link fence bordering the loading area. Miguel noticed her immediately. He didn't startle or shout. He simply crouched down to her level, his voice carrying gently through the cold morning air. "Hey there, little lady. You watching me work?" Sophie tilted her head ever so slightly. It was more response than David had seen in months. Miguel kept sorting as he spoke softly. "This is like a giant puzzle. Everything has its place. Glass here, paper there. Even the broken stuff gets a second chance." David froze a few steps behind, afraid to break the spell. Sophie's entire focus was locked on Miguel's steady hands and careful movements, as if the deliberate order he brought to chaos made her feel safe. "This truck's heavy when it's full," Miguel continued, hefting a bin with effort. "Sometimes I wonder about all the stories inside. Love letters, kids' drawings, photos of better times. Every piece of trash was something important once." Sophie's lips parted slightly. David's chest tightened with hope. Miguel glanced up at him finally, giving a respectful nod. Your daughter's got good focus. Most kids get bored watching this pretty fast. Sophie, David managed to say, we should head home. But Sophie didn't move. She stayed rooted, eyes wide as Miguel explained how the hydraulic arm worked, how gears and pressure turned weight into motion. And for the first time since Marcus died, Sophie didn't look empty. She looked present. When Miguel finished his route, he wiped his hands on a rag tucked in his belt and walked to the fence where Sophie still stood. I'll be back Thursday, he said simply. Same time, same place. If you want to watch again. Sophie nodded. One clear, deliberate nod that nearly knocked David off his feet. Walking home, he watched her steps lighter, quicker, as if she'd shed a tiny piece of grief. That night, he found himself researching sanitation pickup schedules on the same computer that once launched billion-dollar software. It felt absurd, but Sophie's nod replayed like a miracle. Marcus had always said healing comes from unexpected places. David was beginning to see how true that was. Sometimes the most powerful teachers wear work boots, not degrees, showing children that even what's discarded can become something valuable again. Children often open up when they feel safe, not when they are pressured. Safety can appear in the most ordinary routines. Steadiness speaks louder than words. Thursday arrived like a promise Sophie had silently been waiting to collect. David canceled investor meetings without hesitation, something that it would have been unthinkable just 2 weeks earlier. Sophie pressed her nose against the lobby window, scanning the street with an intensity that made David's chest ache. Miguel appeared on schedule, his steady rhythm unchanged. Sophie practically pulled David through the doors to greet him. Miguel tipped his cap. Morning, Sophie, ready to see some organized chaos. What followed dismantled David's entire notion of what education looked like. Miguel didn't just collect garbage, he turned it into stories. He showed Sophie how aluminum cans became bicycles, how newspapers came back as cereal boxes, how broken glass transformed into windows framing someone else's future. But it was an offhand comment that froze David mid-breath. This is systems theory, Miguel said casually. Sorting paper from plastic. Everything connects. Break one part. The whole thing struggles. David blinked. That was a graduate-level social work vocabulary. He'd seen the same phrasing in Marcus's psychology journals. The truth unraveled over the next few days. Miguel wasn't just a sanitation worker who liked children. He had a master's degree in social work from Columbia. He had once counseled families in crisis until being terminated by the Department of Social Services. The reason chilled David's sexual orientation incompatible with family values. His dismissal letter had said, Meanwhile, Miguel had been quietly observing Sophie's behavior, recognizing what every expensive specialist had missed: selective mutism rooted in grief. Not trauma. Sophie wasn't broken. She was trying to protect David from collapsing by erasing her own needs. When David confronted him, the conversation cracked years of frustration open. You saw me as just the guy who empties trash, Miguel said, voice calm but eyes burning. You never asked what I knew. You decided my worth by my uniform. You should have told me you were qualified to help. David snapped. Miguel's laugh was brittle. Qualified, I've been helping her from day one. The real question is if you're qualified to see past your own pride. From the lobby window, Sophie watched them argue, her hands pressed flat to the glass. When Miguel walked away, tears streamed silently down her face, the first David had seen since Marcus died. That night, Sophie built block towers with mechanical precision while David sat beside her, gutted. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt purposeful. She had been trying to disappear, believing if she stayed small and quiet, the last piece of her family wouldn't shatter. His phone buzzed relentlessly, urgent emails, plummeting stock, panicked board members. But watching Sophie place each block perfectly aligned, David realized she wasn't failing to speak. She was succeeding at something else entirely, carrying both their grief so he could keep standing. Miguel had seen this instantly because he understood pain not from textbooks, but from surviving it. True expertise often hides in work clothes and quiet dedication. It isn't measured by credentials, but by the courage to truly see people. Sometimes the greatest healing comes not from fixing what's broken, but from creating a safe space where growth can quietly begin. Children grieving often become caretakers of adults' emotions. Recognizing this burden and lifting it off their small shoulders is the first step toward real healing. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday that shattered the fragile calm David had built. Immigration and Customs Enforcement had Miguel Santos in their crosshairs. Triggered by an anonymous tip about undocumented workers in the sanitation department, David only discovered this when Sophie's Thursday vigil at the window stretched into hours. No orange vest, no rhythmic sorting of discarded dreams, just absence that felt like another death. The call came from Miguel's supervisor detention facility upstate, deportation hearing within days. David's blood turned to ice as he listened to the cold language of bureaucracy describe the man who had just begun to pull Sophie back to life. At the same time, his corporate world betrayed him. The board had tracked every missed meeting, every delayed decision. They struck with surgical precision. Helen Richardson, his own mother, sat across from him in the boardroom that once felt like his kingdom. Her alliance with the board gutted him. "You're not fit to lead this company anymore," she said flatly. Sophie needs stability, not a father unraveling in public. The coup was swift and brutal. His voting shares were frozen pending a competency review. His access to company resources vanished overnight. Everything he had built to honor Marcus's memory was being stripped by those who claimed to love him. Then came the cruelest blow. Marcus's parents, Robert and Catherine Wells, reappeared after years of silence. Their grief curdled into something that looked like righteousness. They had rejected Marcus's marriage, refused to acknowledge Sophie as their granddaughter, and vanished after the funeral. Now they wanted custody. Their lawyer presented paperwork showing that Marcus's adoption of Sophie had never been finalized before his death, leaving the Wells family with a biological claim that superseded David's legal rights. Helen sided with them. She believed Sophie needed traditional stability rather than a father collapsing under grief. And then the ICE raid hit before dawn. Miguel was processing trucks at the depot when armed agents swarmed. David watched the footage from his stripped-down office, seeing Miguel led away in handcuffs while coworkers scattered. Sophie's response was devastating. She retreated so deep into silence that David feared she'd disappear completely. No eye contact, no response. She had learned that people could vanish without warning and was preparing for the inevitable. The detention center was a cold monument to indifference. Miguel sat behind reinforced glass, his orange jumpsuit a cruel parody of the safety vest that had become Sophie's symbol of hope. "I didn't tell you about my legal status," he whispered through the phone, "because I was afraid you'd see me as less, like everyone else does." Miguel's parents had died in Hurricane Katrina when he was 17. He'd lived under temporary protections that expired years ago, too afraid to apply for permanent status because exposure meant deportation. Meanwhile, the custody hearing loomed like an execution. Social workers combed through David's life, documenting instability. Helen testified that he was unfit. The Wells family flaunted their suburban home and wealth. Sophie flinched at every whispered discussion of her future. David faced an impossible choice: fight for his company and risk losing Sophie, or abandon his empire to protect her. Either path meant destruction. The breaking point came when Sophie spoke for the first time in weeks. David found her sitting in Marcus's old study, surrounded by photographs. "Papa Marcus told me families are made of love, not rules," she whispered, barely audible. Why doesn't anyone else understand that? In that moment, David knew what had to break and what had to endure. True leadership isn't about control. It's about knowing what deserves protection and sacrificing everything else. Sometimes the bravest act is to walk away from what the world says matters, to guard what truly does. Children don't need perfect parents. They need parents who will choose them, even when everything else demands to be chosen first. David Richardson walked into the deportation hearing with nothing left to lose except everything that mattered. He had liquidated personal assets, art pieces, bonuses, and unfrozen holdings, and placed an irrevocable instruction to divest a portion of his frozen shares once the board's restrictions were lifted. The proceeds funded top-tier legal counsel for Miguel and launched a nonprofit immigration clinic to defend families facing separation. The courtroom overflowed with people. Sanitation workers filled the gallery in their orange vests. Sophie sat in the front row beside Helen, who looked shaken by the toll her own choices had taken. Miguel's lawyer focused not on technicalities but on community impact. Witnesses testified about Miguel's volunteer work with homeless youth, his care for his disabled foster sister Carmen, and his quiet leadership during neighborhood crises. But it was Sophie's recorded voice that changed the room. Papa Marcus used to say, "Heroes don't wear capes." Her small voice echoed through the speakers. "They wear work boots and show up when people need them most. Miguel is my hero because he saw me when nobody else could." The immigration judge, a woman whose own family had once fled persecution, listened with grave understanding. Miguel's deportation was stayed pending a full asylum review based on anti-LGBT persecution in his home country, acknowledging changed country conditions that made returning dangerous. Across town, the custody hearing unfolded like a different kind of war. Robert and Catherine Wells presented their stable suburban life and traditional family structure. On paper, they looked ideal. Then Helen took the stand. She spoke about losing her older son to AIDS in the 80s, about the fear that has shaped her prejudice, about watching Sophie come back to life under David's care. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I thought traditional meant better." She said, "I was wrong. Sophie doesn't need perfect. She needs the father who's been showing up every day, learning how to love her as she is." When the judge asked if Sophie wanted to speak privately, she surprised everyone by standing in open court. Her voice was quiet but unwavering. "Papa Marcus told me families are made of people who choose you every day, not just people who share your blood," she said, looking at her grandparents. "David chose me when I couldn't speak. Miguel chose me when I couldn't trust. They didn't fix me. They just loved me until I felt safe enough to fix myself." Silence rippled through the courtroom. The Wells family had no rebuttal, only the heavy recognition of their own absence when love was most needed. Judge Miguel Santos, no relation to Miguel, awarded David permanent custody and guardianship, with structured visitation rights for the Wells family, and granted legal permission to finalize Marcus's pending adoption of Sophie. 7 years later, Miguel stood in a packed citizenship ceremony, raising his right hand while David and Sophie stood as his chosen family witnesses. Sophie spoke freely now, though she still used silence when words weren't enough. What had once seemed like brokenness had become her strength, teaching everyone around her to listen differently. David's immigration clinic had helped dozens of families stay together. Miguel was studying immigration law while continuing his sanitation route. Their love grew slowly, rooted in shared purpose, not desperation. Helen volunteered at an LGBT youth center, transformed from fearful grandmother to fierce advocate. The Wells family kept distant but respectful contact, slowly learning to honor Marcus's memory by supporting the family Sophie had chosen. That spring, Sophie stood on stage at school giving a presentation on courage. Courage is loving people the world says are wrong. It's sacrificing safety to protect someone smaller than you. It's choosing family by action, not by blood, she told the crowd, her voice clear and radiant. David watched from the audience, Miguel's hand warm in his, finally understanding that wealth meant nothing compared to the riches of belonging. Their family didn't look like the pictures in magazines, but it was everything Marcus had dreamed they could be. Have you ever had to choose between what society expected and what your heart knew was right? What would you sacrifice to protect the people who truly see and love you? Share your thoughts below and follow Heart Stories for more powerful tales of families brave enough to rewrite what love looks like.